Joining us now, CNN political analyst David Gregory. David Sanger, national security correspondent for the New York Times, who had an interesting conversation with the president at one point, we might add. And former federal prosecutor Shan Wu. Shan, I want to start with you because you are the lawyer here. What is Rudy Giuliani doing? All of a sudden, basically saying, and I'm paraphrasing here loosely, okay, so maybe there was some collusion, just not the president.
He's looking for a safe space to go to, and really, it's in some ways not surprising at all. First of all, he changes his story a lot. But the evidence at this point, in my opinion, technically, it's already established there's collusion. You have Manafort's at meeting and giving the polling information. You have other folks who have lied about contacts. That's already there. That case has already been established. Now, what's not established is, did somebody in the campaign actually authorize that? Who else knew about it? Does it go to the president? But at this point, it's already a closed book on the fact that there was contact between Trump's campaign and the Russians.
David Gregory, let's just parse what Rudy Giuliani said again, because, you know, there's one school of thought which is, wow, he really sort of shoots from the hip and, you know, he accidentally says things on camera. And then if you look at what he has said over the past year, sometimes it previews then a revelation, something that he says that sounds outlandish, then previews some news that's about to break, such as Stormy Daniels, when he said it seemed in an aside to Sean Hannity, oh, well, you know, the president reimbursed Michael Cohen for that, and everybody, you know, hit the brakes and said, what? And then it turned out that the president there was money involved and money exchanged. So let's just listen one more time to what Rudy Giuliani told Chris Cuomo last night and see if we can understand why he's saying it now.
I never said there was no collusion between the campaign or between people in the campaign. I have no idea if I have not. I said the President of the United States. There is not a single bit of evidence the President of the United States committed the only crime you could commit here, conspired with the Russians to hack the DNC.
You know what, David, one more thing. I do just want to play, back in July, you know, Rudy Giuliani made, I think you might have even been on with me, David Gregory, the day that Rudy Giuliani came on,
yes,
New Day, and made the rounds.
He's still talking.
We had a long interview that day, and right after my interview with him, he then went on, he said so many things during our New Day interview, he then went on Fox, and they had to ask him to clarify. So let me just play what he said on Fox, which is completely different than what he said last night.
Is it still the position of you and your client that there was no collusion with the Russians whatsoever on behalf of the Trump campaign?
Correct. When I say the Trump campaign, I mean the upper levels of the Trump campaign. I have no reason to believe anybody else did.
Okay. So that's when he said there was no collusion, and last night he changed. What's going on?
Well, you know, what we don't know is how much Giuliani knows at this point. The role he's playing as kind of chief pugilist on TV, as TV lawyer for President Trump. But what he's established, I think, over a long period of time, what he's tried to establish is, well, whatever bad may have been going on, Donald Trump was not responsible, is not guilty of anything. This kind of attempt to insulate the president from any actual criminal wrongdoing. We don't know what comes of that and what Mueller actually has. But what I see is the outlines of a strategy here in a defense is, well, there may have been some bad actors who were you know, sharing information, who were working with the Russians in their quest to destabilize the election, but it wasn't Trump, and he didn't know about it. The problem with that is how, as the head of the campaign, as the candidate, and ultimately the president, do you not own any of that if it actually happened? Mm-hmm. And secondarily, we also know of a lot of contacts, whether it was his son potentially talking to him after a meeting. The president knew of stuff that was going on as a candidate, and we have confirmation of that by the fact that he runs everything. He is his own chief of staff. He is a gut player who likes to dictate everything. The idea that he was totally insulated from that is pretty hard to believe.
Look, Rudy Giuliani, in the theater, David Gregory will appreciate, there's a term called Chekhov's gun. You see the gun in the first act, it has to go off in the second or third. When Rudy Giuliani says what he says last night, that it wasn't the president who colluded, I never said no one else did, what that means is that in the second act, we're going to find out who did collude. To me, that's what it is here. He also said a lot of other things to Chris last night. Let's play a little bit more of these new parameters set out by the president's own lawyer.
He's viable at the head of the campaign, giving polling data that winds up having the same faces and places targeted by the campaign that are targeted by Russian trolls. How is that not collusion?
It's not collusion.
How is it not?
Well, because polling data is given to everybody. I mean, you shouldn't have given it to them. It's wrong to give it to them.
It's not given to everybody.
And I can't speak for Paul Manafort. Of course it is. First of all, the most inappropriate, the most inaccurate stuff is internal polling data.
All right, leave that aside. Let's go back to the collusion for a second, where the president said, essentially, I never said there was no collusion between the campaign. And he also says the only crime here that could possibly be committed is if the president somehow personally hacked the DNC's computers there. David Sanger, that's not the case. I mean, the special counsel's mandate was to go out and find any links and or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the campaign of President Donald Trump. Again, it seems to me what Rudy Giuliani is doing is telling us one thing, and we're going to find out a whole lot more about it tomorrow.
Well, John, when I heard it, I thought the defense now is down to Plan C. No, Plan A was that the White House press secretary and others came out in February of 2017 and said no one from the campaign had any contact with the Russians, period. Okay. We now know there are a lot of contacts with the Russians.
And a lot of guilty pleas and convictions as a result.
Convictions and conversations between the National Security Advisor, Flynn, at the time, and of course Paul Manafort and others. Plan B was to say no one actually colluded, all those tapes that you just ran, that there may have been contacts, but it wasn't collusion. That came from the president himself. Now Plan C is there may have been collusion, it may have been at the higher levels, but it didn't hit the president. So they're basically the last firewall is the president himself, which was what makes it so interesting that the president worked so hard in the first year or two to make the argument that maybe the Russians didn't have anything to do with the hacking of the DNC at all, which was the core of that conversation that you mentioned.
We'll get to that, I promise you.
But David Sanger, I want to stick with you for a second because you, it turns out, were integral. You played an integral role in this new reporting about what the president and Vladimir Putin spoke about in Hamburg. Right. And we don't know because, as you know, there was nobody else allowed in the room other than his interpreter, and he then took his interpreter's notes and told his interpreter never to share any of this with anyone. And so in the New York Times, Peter Baker is reporting this week, the day after the two meetings, Mr. Trump was on Air Force One taking off from Germany, heading back to Washington. He telephoned a Times reporter, and he argued that the Russians were falsely accused of election interference. While he insisted most of the conversations be off the record, he later repeated a few things in public in little noticed asides. You were that reporter that he phoned.
Yeah.
Something happened in Hamburg during that conversation that made President Trump want to call you and say the Russians had been falsely accused. And something happened during that conversation that was either so sensitive or so embarrassing to the president that he confiscated the interpreter's notes.
That's right. So in Hamburg, there was one other witness. It would be interesting to hear from him, and it's Rex Tillerson.
Well, wait, hold on a second, because there were a few different meetings in Hamburg. So Rex Tillerson was in one of them, and then there was a dinner conversation that was private.
That's right. And for that, the president didn't have his interpreter. I believe there was only the Russian interpreter, so we're not likely to hear from them. So the phone call was, and as it said, most of it was off the record, but some of what he said to me, he then immediately said when he landed back in public. So it was in his mind. And what it basically was that Vladimir Putin had made the argument that the Russians are so good at hacking that had they done it, they never would have been caught. And he said, I found that a pretty convincing argument. I said to him, well, you know, if you go back and look at what the intelligence reports told you, they all told you that Vladimir Putin not only was aware of it, he ordered it. Do you believe your own U.S. intelligence reports or Putin? And he said, how could I believe people like John Brennan and Comey and so forth? He took it immediately to the personal, that they're so political that he couldn't believe it.
And so he believes Vladimir Putin over them, and that is the upshot.
Well, could be that, or it could be that he needed to establish a storyline that will never prove that it was the Russians. And what's happened since? A very detailed indictment of the GRU from Mueller with conversations among the Russians on this issue. And maybe that's what Rudy Giuliani is a little worried about here, because if Mueller was so deeply inside the Russian system that he had conversations among GRU officers and others, makes you wonder what other conversations he may have between the Russians and campaign.
Just to be clear, this is in the summer of 2017, well after the campaign, and the president is proactively calling you.
That's right.
To make the case, that the Russians did not attack the U.S. election system.
And then he came out in public about a day or two later. No one really paid attention to it at the time and said, well, it's not at all clear. Many people say the Russians are so good that we'd never see this. That was basically his line during that summer.
And can I ask also, during this time also, because everything happened so closely together in this summer, was also the time when he was dictating memos and dictating responses about Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting in Trump Tower with the Russians, where Trump Jr. was promised dirt on Hillary Clinton from the Russians.
It was on that same flight. He called me as they were taking off. We got disconnected at some point as the plane went up. It was on his cell phone. And then it looks like, from what's been reconstructed since, that that's when he worked up the answer, what we now believe to be a false or at least misleading answer about what the meeting in Trump Tower was all about.
Shan Wu, this is why lawmakers today would like to subpoena that interpreter, because something happened in Hamburg during those meetings, we don't know what, that was so inspiring to President Trump that he wanted to call David Sanger and say that the Russians had been falsely accused of election interference.
Absolutely, and there's no interpreter privilege that attaches, so that's something that is viable. And this problem with the president wanting to have these private conversations, that's exactly the reason why lawyers are so careful to have witnesses. Prosecutors have agents, defense counsel will have their own investigators there, because you don't want to be the only person there. He needs to have skilled people with him, experts on the subject matter, to avoid, 1, misunderstandings, 2, misconceptions, and 3, someone else saying that he said something that he didn't say. And his insistence on not doing it that way really works not only to the detriment of the governance, but also leaves him wide open to the allegations that come out at this point. I mean, it originates in a counterintelligence investigation. It's becoming more and more clear why it originated in a counterintelligence investigation.
And can I just say, we get insight into the president's frame of mind, both as a candidate and then as a president, who throughout, as David was referencing, his view that his own intelligence services and those who had it were so tainted that they couldn't be trusted, that the fix was in against him, that he had to operate outside of them to have a conversation with Putin. Again, we don't know what the content is. It raises all kinds of questions about what they were discussing, what the intent of it was. I won't even speculate, except to say that how suspicious that is. But that he would operate outside of that, because in his mind, no one else could be trusted on this issue because everybody was conspiring against him. That's the mindset that I guarantee you will be taken to the very end in his own defense of whatever they find.
Shan, I just want to wrap this conversation up again with this new place we seem to be in this morning than we were last night, when Rudy Giuliani came on CNN and basically said, I never said there was no collusion between the campaign. In the past, going back to the Stormy Daniels days, Rudy Giuliani would go on TV and say, the president paid or he authorized the payment for Stormy Daniels, and everyone thought, oh my gosh, that's crazy. What is Rudy doing here? But it seems to have been something deliberate. Is that what's going on here?
I think so. And remember, Giuliani is the personal attorney, so his loyalty, his job is to protect the human being here as opposed to the administration or the president. So even if he does not have access to a lot of incriminating facts that Mueller may know, his instinct certainly tells him that this is a problem. The walls are basically narrowing David's point of plan A, B, and C. He's down to plan D or E at this point. So he's got to go in that direction. And I think it shows that he understands the dangers involved here. And the last defense, the last firewall really is to make sure you protect your human being, the client.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for helping us attempt to analyze what is happening this morning and last night.